Hi, friends. Welcome to library. Thank you for coming to read with me. So, we have left off with Lions and Liars, and they have figured out that Frederick is not um, Dash. And there's a Category 5 hurricane coming. And Antbite is so disappointed. He has gone off. He's going to go on that cruise with or without anybody. He doesn't even care. And he's left camp. But in all the chaos with the split tires and the sugar and the gas tanks and Glow coming in with the real Dash, nobody's paying attention and they don't realize that Antbite's there, not there. And Frederick is trying to rally everybody and he's saying, I don't care if you guys don't want to be my friends again, but we have to get Antbite. And they're just all ignoring him, not listening. So he feels like he's kind of on his own to go get Antbite. And Gloria is expecting him to get into the car and go. And he's like, you know what? I'm going to go and I'm going to go find him. So we're on chapter 17, the Kudo. Dash, come back here. Benjamin's voice called after him. Dash! Frederick ran past the small cabins at the edge of the camp and didn't slow down when he got to the dodgeball field. His feet pounded across the scrubby grass. Less than an hour ago, on this field, he had experienced glory for the first time, and maybe last time. But he didn't have time to think about that right now. He raced over the far edge of the field and into the forest that surrounded Camp Omagashi. Frederick turned his head this way and that, looking for Antbite, trying to spot a flash of white t-shirt or a glimpse of dark hair against all the brown and green. Antbite couldn't have gotten too far. He had been walking, whereas Frederick was running, so Frederick was bound to catch him soon. He would find Antbite and warn him about the hurricane. Antbite would probably still be mad at him, but Frederick would just have to live with that. They would come back to camp together and be okay. That was all that mattered. There were no paths through the woods, but Frederick's feet seemed to instinctively find a route by avoiding the thickest brambles and tightest clusters of scrub. But when the brambles and scrub got thicker and thicker, Frederick slowed to a walk, panting. The giant red jersey stuck to his sweaty back like saran wrap to a pudding. Antbite! Frederick called. He stopped walking so that the crunch of leaves under his shoes cut off. Frederick listened so hard he felt like his ears were twitching. The chirps, peeps, and squawks of dozens of birds grew louder and louder as he listened. The roar of wind in the pine tops, the buzz of insects, but no answering call from Antbite. Frederick cupped his hand around his mouth and tipped his head back. Antbite! The birds went on with their own conversations, as if Frederick shouting down below them didn't matter. He started walking again, swatting at a gnat that was flying around his head. A tree root caught the toe of Frederick's shoe, and he had to hop several steps to keep his balance. He regained his footing and steadied himself, looking back at the dumb root that had tripped him. Then he looked up again. Something had changed. The woods seemed different, less friendly. What if Antbite hadn't come this way? He might have gone a little more that way, Frederick thought, looking to the left. Or a little bit more that way, he looked right. Or maybe he'd gotten farther than Frederick had guessed, and he might be a mile ahead of Frederick. How much time did he have before the counselors left without him? Slowly, Frederick looked back in the directions of the camp. The tree that he had walked past stretched strangely into the distance, like a camera zooming out. Everything looked different from this angle. Was camp really that way? Frederick needed to go back. He needed to go back before he couldn't find his way back. But without wanting to, he remembered how Antbite had helped him win that dodgeball and everything he had said after, and Frederick winced. Somebody like you, the words echoed in his mind. The gnat that had been orbiting his head was now trying to drink the fluid off the surface of his eyes. Ah! He growled at the empty woods and slapped at the gnat. He turned back around and stomped after Antbite again. Or, at least, he started stomping in the direction he hoped Antbite had gone. Antbite! He yelled, and he heard a creaky, squeaky note in his voice. He clenched and unclenched his hands as he walked. His foot crunched a pine cone. Rough pine bark was everywhere he turned. Frustration and fear made his vision shaky, and his breath was so loud in his own ears that he wondered or he worried if Ant Bite did call out to him, he wouldn't be able to hear it. Crunch, crunch, crunch went the leaves. Whoosh, whoosh went Frederick's breath. After a while, he began to imagine that he heard voices, wheedling their way through the noise in his own head. Great, he thought. I'm hearing voices now. Frederick slowed down. He did hear voices. Antbite, he said, and he picked up his pace, jogging toward the sound. As the voices got louder, the trees began to thin, and suddenly Frederick jogged out of the forest and found himself at the bottom of a ditch on a roadside. The blacktop was high, over his head, and a steep bank of grass rose between him and the pavement. He'd never realized riding in the car how tall highways could be compared to the land around them. He heard banging, and then a man's voice called out, "Make sure those bolts are secure." Relief flooded Frederick. They were adult voices. They could help him. Maybe they'd even seen Antbite. He climbed up the hill and onto the freeway and looked left and right. Frederick did a double take. To the right, far off, several tractor trailer trucks were wrecked, lying on their sides, having skidded off the road and into the trees. "Whoa," Frederick whispered. He moved closer. Tires were suspended in the air. Metal cabs were crushed like Coke cans. Glass frosted the road, glittering in the sun. It looked like something out of a movie. Well, Frederick amended, a movie like Transformers, not one like The Secret Garden or Winnie the Pooh. He moved cautiously toward the trucks. "Is anybody hurt?" a woman yelled. "We're all good here," a man answered. As Frederick got closer, he saw men and women moving around the trucks, climbing up on the overturned trailers and calling out to one another. None of them had noticed Frederick yet. He paused, trying to take in the scene. A logo on one of the trucks said Jacksonville Zoo and Gardens. Glow had said the Jacksonville Zoo was evacuating, Frederick remembered. He was about to call out to them when an explosion of squawks from one of the trailers made him jump. The squawks died down and then rose again. It sounded like an entire flock of birds was trying to get out of the trailer. "There are nails in the road," a man shouted. He tore the baseball cap off his head and scraped a heavy work boot against the asphalt. "Someone's put nails in the road." He slapped his baseball cap against the side of his thigh. "Hey," a woman shouted, "he's out! The mail's gone!" The man swore and tugged his cap securely back on his head. "Get the trank," the woman called. "Okay, everybody listen up," the man shouted. "We've got to get him back. Mitch, you got the tracker?" "Yeah," a man shouted. Frederick lifted a hand, opening his mouth. "This way," Mitch said. "Hey!" Frederick called. The men and woman jogged down the road away from Frederick. "Wait!" he called, running after them. They were shouting to one another, and maybe they didn't hear him. Or maybe they thought he was one of them running and shouting. Whatever the reason, they didn't slow down. "Wait!" Frederick yelled again, his feet pounding the pavement. He ran after them until his lungs burned. Then he kept walking down the middle of the road, watching the zookeepers get smaller and smaller until, when they were far ahead, they turned off the road and disappeared into the woods. And Frederick was alone again. He walked along the empty road. On either side of the road, pine trees tossed in the wind. The trunks swayed. Clouds grew thick in the sky. Frederick was trying not to notice these things. Instead, he was trying to think about about how hurricanes were slow moving. His traitorous brain reminded him that he'd once thought the Omagashi River was slow moving. He tried to think about how the hurricane was probably way out in the ocean, so he had plenty of time. He tried to think that he was going to find Antbite really soon. He tried to think about how many minutes now he would hear the growl of the diesel truck and how Glow's eyes would bug out as she yelled at him for running off. He tried to think about how hungry he was. The last This last one was easy because he hadn't eaten anything all day. And he would have, for real, given away his entire college savings account for some of Miss Betty's pancakes right then. Frederick walked to the edge of the road and half climbed, half slid down the ditch. He went to the first tree he came to and sat down, leaning back against the rough trunk. The wind lifted the hair off his forehead. The chances of someone in a search party finding him in time were probably like 1 in 100,000. He imagined Roger's voice saying, it wouldn't be an even number like that. It would probably be like 1 In 382,005. Shoot, Frederick muttered, banging the back of his head against the pine tree trunk. His eyes watered, and so what? Nobody would know. He might as well cry. But what if, a voice in his head insisted, someone from the search party walked up at the exact moment he was crying? He could wipe his eyes as fast as he could, but it would be obvious that he'd been crying because his eyes would be puffy and red. They would know, and he would know that they knew. He pushed himself off the ground and started to walk off the crying feeling. As he walked, it did seem like he was leaving his tears behind, but every step brought him closer and closer to the fact that he had been wrong. He had been wrong at the dodgeball game, and after the dodgeball game, too. The others had helped him win, and he hadn't said thank you. Aunt Bite and Specs and the professor had wanted to go on a cruise. He hadn't even listened to them. He'd been mean to Aunt Bite. He'd been a bad person. He'd known that for a while now. He had known it even before he left camp to go after Ant Bite. He'd been trying to not know it because every time he thought about it, shame squeezed his heart. The fact was that he had acted like Joel and Raj, maybe even worse. He had acted the way he'd always hated. He hadn't meant to, not exactly. It just happened. But he knew that that didn't make it all right. Frederick was going to have to find a way to fix it. He would fix it, and then he would feel better, and he would never do it again. He just hoped he could fix it. God, Frederick said out loud, I know that last time this didn't work, but maybe that's because you were saving up something you knew that that I'd need an even bigger favor later. That was really great of you. Frederick wanted God to know that he didn't have any hard feelings about the whole not helping him when he was in the river thing. But I was just hoping that, if you don't mind too much, you could maybe get me out of here." He paused. "An Antbite, too," he said. "And soon. Soon would be good. I mean, whenever you want is fine, and help me make it right with Antbite and the others, okay? Okay? I'll be ready to get out of here in 5, 4, 3, 2." Frederick swallowed. "1." There was nothing. No sound of a person coming to help, no sign of Antbite. Frederick was alone. Then the wind shifted the clouds and the sky brightened. A column of sunlight lanced through the gloom. Frederick's eyes, drawn to the sunbeam, followed it down, and there, standing in front of him, framed by brilliant light, was a strange and graceful animal. It reminded Frederick of a deer. It had a dusty colored coat with white stripes. Its horns were tall and spiraled gently upward. The animal held its head proudly. Its ears flicked, and it turned its neck to regard Frederick with startled, wet eyes. "Wow," Frederick breathed. The deer must have been the animal that had escaped from the truck, the one all the zookeepers were looking for. Frederick didn't move for fear of scaring the animal away. The ears flicked again, and its tongue stretched out and touched its nose. Other than these tiny, sudden movements, it stood perfectly still, while all around it the woods tossed and swayed in the wind. Frederick had the sense that he and the deer were in a bubble and that inside it time had stopped. He could live in this moment forever and nothing could touch him. He didn't need to feel ashamed of anything or afraid of anything. Then there was motion behind the deer. Frederick looked and saw an enormous lion placing its front paw soundlessly on the ground. Its golden eyes were fixed on the deer. Frederick gasped just as the lion unfurled like silk and launched itself at the beautiful animal. The deer made a sudden bleating sound as the lion's jaws closed on its hind quarters. The deer's front legs scrabbled at the ground like it was trying to run, even as the lion dragged it back. Frederick's mouth opened to scream, but his lungs were deflated, and the only sound that came out was a weak "ee," like air leaking from a tire. Then someone was running out of the woods toward him. Frederick eat with more energy. "Run!" Aunt Bite yelled, dragging at Frederick's arm. "Run!" Frederick didn't need telling twice. Well, Aunt Bite had just told him twice, so he had needed telling twice, but he didn't need telling a third time. He ran, pumping his arms, keeping pace with Aunt Bite, and he would have left Aunt Bite in the dust if he could have, but the smaller boy was running flat out too. "That's a Frederick choked out as he ran. I know it's a lying, Aunt Bite yelled. Run! Holy moly. So this is quite the adventure. It's apparent that there's chaos everywhere. When the zoo was evacuating, it appears that somebody laid nails all over the road, which sabotaged that evacuation. So when the tires popped, all the vehicles that were carrying the animals from the zoo crashed and turned over. And obviously, the lion was what had gotten out. That's pretty scary. So stay tuned for chapter 18, the letter. And I'm curious, do Frederick and Aunt Bite make it back? Do they have to hide? I'm just so curious. Anyway, thanks for reading with me. Have a great week.